So nice to see all of you today. I wasn't sure whether, I know that I would not have been able to find this place, so I'm really happy that all of you could. I've worn so many hats in my life that it was difficult to think about what I might talk about today. And I've had to leave a few things to the side, but for the most part, I just decided to talk about, to do a extremely quick survey from the mid-60s to the present, focusing on focusing on whatever was in the last slideshow that I put together, primarily, I have to admit. So I left home when I was 18 and went to study architecture in Winnipeg in the middle of Canada. Winnipeg is even colder than Chicago. It's the coldest city in North America. And back in those days, in about 1965, so I was telling Zach today, a normal winter day was 10 below. A warm day was 0. So we can feel very lucky at the weather we have now. And I almost immediately got involved with the student newspaper for the University of Manitoba and began designing these inserts. I think this is about 66. So they're a little bit ahead of their time, but typical of what was about to appear at that moment. And in 67, I dropped out of university because in those days, all the good students dropped out. That's what we did. So I dropped out with 8 of my classmates, and we formed a free school, a commune, of course, an underground newspaper, and our own store as well, which we called a free store, although we sold things there. And this is the newspaper that we published, the Loving Couch Press. Now, it's a kind of interesting moment in history. The web offset press appeared in the early 60s, and it was a machine that revolutionized publishing because suddenly it was possible to print something cheaply. And so suddenly people like us could produce our own newspaper in relatively limited quantities. Back then you could print as few as 1,000 copies of something, and it was really dirt cheap. Nowadays, I think the machines are so fast nowadays, you turn them on and off and you've printed 5,000 copies, but it's still a remarkably cheap method. So suddenly special interest publishing was possible, and the underground newspaper was really the first product of that revolution. So this is one of the copies of the Loving Couch Press. It was called, this one with Yoko Ono on the cover. And I was the graphic designer for most of the issues, not all of them. And this was another publication we put out called The Magazine, and it used the mimeograph. And again, in the 60s, really in the late 50s, I guess, the mimeograph appeared. And a lot of writers, more than artists, but also some artists, began to use the mimeograph as a means of doing much smaller quantities, maybe 100 or 200, but in a very affordable and easy way. So this, I doubt that we published more than 50 of this, but so this is about 67 also. So the commune, I'll just say a bit about why that experiment ended. I mean, it was a very interesting experiment because it was based on the Diggers. Now, the Diggers, as we knew it, was a movement in San Francisco, which was based on the idea of there being no such thing as personal property. And it actually dates back to, I think, the 16th century in Britain, when the Diggers movement was a radical Christian movement of communes in which there was no personal property. So without realizing it, we were basing our commune on a radical Christian commune of many hundreds of years earlier. One of our rules was that anybody who came to the door and wanted to live with us was allowed to move in as long as they agreed to participate in the Monday evening meeting at which all decisions were decided by consensus. And it began with 8 of us. So 8 people meeting and deciding everything by consensus is fine. Difficult, but fine. 12 people, almost impossible. 25, really getting into a lot of fighting. 50, really difficult. 65, the whole thing fell apart. So the experiment lasted for 1 year, but it was an extremely interesting year. I moved to Toronto, actually, to check out something called Rochdale College. It was another intentional community, a commune, which had actually managed to raise money to build themselves a 14-story, a new 14-story building. And I moved in there briefly. It kind of fell apart quickly, too, because the Hells Angels moved in and kind of took over, and it became a drug center, and then the police closed it down, and then it became an old folks' home. But this is a little house that I moved into in '69 with a group of friends, 78 Gerrard Street West. Pitiful little house, actually. Really cold, almost no heat. We didn't know each other so well. There were 7 or 8 of us squeezed into that little house, and that's how General Idea began. So this is the group of, most of the group. I think I'm taking the picture, so I'm not in the picture there. And our living room, I mean, the house was on an old shopping street, which had been the kind of the Carnaby Street of Toronto, and then had fallen on harder times. There were flowers painted on the street, and our house had a store window that looked straight onto the street. So we began making, to entertain ourselves, I mean, we were all unemployed. To entertain ourselves, we began making fake storefronts. And we would, for example, we found a lot of, we found boxes and boxes of nurse romance novels thrown out from a neighboring bookstore. And we brought them to our storefront and set them all up, made a kind of fake bookstore, and then put a sign on the window that said, back in 5 minutes. And there was a nurse's residence just around the corner, so we would hide in the back and watch the nurses all looking in the window, trying to figure out what was going on. And that's how General Idea began, really, and that's how our interest in commerce and consumerism began. It began from raiding the garbage of the businesses in our neighborhood. And this is Jorge standing at the counter of the first kind of mock store that we opened in the space. It was called the Belly Store. And this is the first multiple we ever produced. I think these were for sale for $2 or something. It's just cotton batten inside a plastic bottle with a label that I designed. And I don't think we sold it. It was open for a month, assuming the door was unlocked. And I don't think we sold any copies. Another little experiment, we found a women's clothing store that had closed in 1948 with all the contents intact, mannequins and everything. And we purchased the contents for $150 and reopened it in our living room, in our storefront. This is before the days of retro clothing, before the days of, not before thrift shops, but before trendy thrift shops. And we were very excited because the Globe and Mail, which is Canada's national paper, ran a full-page article on it in the front of what was then called the women's section. But of course, not once in the article did they make reference to the fact that it was an art project. At the end of the month that that store was open, there were only 13 dresses left, and they were all identical. They were this one. It was kind of liver-colored and faded in uneven kinds of ways, and we decided we had to do something with it. So we invented the 1971 Miss General Idea pageant. We made a package of rules and regulations, photographs of previous queens, artist rendering of the artist's conception of Miss General Idea, this kind of thing, and we sent it out with a copy of the dress to 13 friends, all artists. And the idea was that they could choose the person of their choice to be the person they thought should be Miss General Idea, photograph them in the dress, and send the photograph back to us. And this they did. This is the artist's conception of Miss General Idea. It's from a little ad we found in like one of those, they don't exist anymore, but one of those sex newspapers of the era where people would send in little photos and have little ads. And this was, I'm sure, a man, but. This is one of the contestants, one of the choices. She participated under the name of Lady Venus, I think was the name, and she's now a senator in Canada, so I can't say her name. We held the actual competition or the judging at A Space, which was Toronto's first artist-run gallery, and we used as judges sort of real art type judges. There was the head of the visual arts from the Canada Council, a prominent art critic, and a Toronto actor. And this is the person they chose as the winner, Michael Morris, who renamed himself Marcel Idea for the occasion. And the judges said that he had captured glamour without falling into it. And there was a big award ceremony, a kind of award ceremony, in a way, a very typical beauty pageant award ceremony. It was formatted in a kind of television studio way, because a beauty pageant is a television studio event. The audience were given instructions on how to respond at the correct times, and just the key moments were reproduced. And this is Pascal. This is the transgendered opera singer who lived with us. And Pascal was amazing because she had a 7-octave range because of being halfway through the transition process. So Pascal gave us very remarkable entertainment. You know, you have to have entertainment at a beauty pageant. This is File magazine. File is something we started in '72. We had this idea that, you know, being in Toronto, which was so far away from everything and so disconnected from everything, we wanted to do something that would connect us to other parts of the world and to other artists. And this was, in effect, a kind of fake magazine. We made basically the same as the Loving Couch Press. We made an underground newspaper and wrapped a glossy cover around it so it looked like a magazine. Our idea was that if it looked familiar, people would pick it up and maybe even buy it, and they did. So Life wasn't too happy about that, of course. This was the second issue. Here's how we thought about art. This was a little, I've got them in the wrong order. Oh no, that's right. We sent out this little card to about 100 people whose collections we would like to be in. So the card was considered to be a work of art, which we were donating. So on one side it says, General Idea is pleased to donate this work to whoever it is, Bob Phones, who was an artist. And on the other side, General Idea is in the collection of Bob Phones. And then about 2 weeks later, we sent out this announcement, General Idea is in the collections of, with the complete list of all the people. And this is another piece about the artist's relationship to its audience. It's stolen from a teen magazine from the 60s. So on one side, it looks like an envelope with our return address that you can fold up and mail to us. And on the other side, you get to check off, what you think of us. Whether we embarrass you, involve you, and so on and so forth. Eiffel was the issue of File that we made for an exhibition in Paris. Now, around the mid-'70s, of the eight of us, most floated away, and we were left with 3. And then we realized, we'd always kind of built on this idea of anonymity and nobody knowing who we were, who was involved, who wasn't involved. And then we decided to reverse it and promote the fact that there were the 3 of us. So this is Felix and Jorge, and that's me on the right, posing as architects, because we decided now to become architects rather than artists, and we were going to build the Miss General Idea Pavilion. This is Art Metropole in Toronto. It was a center that we founded for selling art, mostly artist books, audio, video, different kinds of artist editions. And it also had an archive. Over the years, the archive got so big that we couldn't afford actually to insure it anymore. And it's now been transferred to the National Gallery of Canada. There's 13,000 items in the collection. So these things can grow fast without you realizing what you're doing. But the Art Metropole was conceived as part of this pavilion that I was mentioning. It was, it was both the library, the archive, and the bookshop, or gallery shop from the Miss General Idea Pavilion. It's our 10-year anniversary, 1978, special issue of File. We had our first museum show in '79 at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. Weird place to have your first show. And we realized, you know, why doesn't every artist have their own museum shop that they can just kind of cart around behind them, and every time they have a show in a museum, they can bring their own museum shop with them. So we built this, the boutique from the Miss General Idea Pavilion, in which we plan to sell our multiples and editions and File magazine and so on. In this photo, it's actually kind of around backwards because it should be a $ when you look from above. And this is one of the editions we did around that time, the Getting into the Spirits cocktail book, in which all of the cocktails were kind of political cocktails, because cocktails, the idea of a cocktail, we didn't have the word postmodern yet, but it was a postmodern idea that you could take different meanings like different alcohols and put them together to create new flavors, new meanings. And we developed a line of cocktail holders, so this is called liquid assets. And there's a recipe in the cocktail book for liquid assets. And here it is on the cover of File. Oh, by the way, this issue of File came out about 4 months before Andy Warhol's $ paintings appeared. And which is interesting to me because I delivered him this issue with my own hands. More files. Poodles started to enter our life. You know, we were really pushing the queer envelope the whole time, but to be queer was kind of, you know, it was the death knell if you spoke it in too articulate a manner. So we were always trying to get a critic to write about us in terms of sexuality, and they never would. So the poodles were like one strategy amongst many trying to push the critics further and further. It didn't really work. Babies, 3 babies in bed, it's apparently about collaboration. This is a flag which we produced for the city of Ghent in Belgium, and it's identical to the real flag, except the real flag is a lion, and we turned the lion into a poodle. It was done for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Ghent, and the idea was that 50 of these flags would go up on the city flagpoles. However, the city council got wind of it, and the Flemish councillors, because it's a separatist city, really. I mean, it's mostly Flemish, but a few French councillors. So the Flemish councillors were outraged that we had changed the Flemish lion into a French poodle. And this sort of violent verbal fight broke out on the city council, which lasted about 2 days. And for the next 2 days, all the newspaper headlines were all cartoons of the various councillors, either as lions or as poodles. And finally, the city decided they should take them down. All the flags came down. Private people came forward because Ghent is a city of flagpoles, and all the flags went back up again. I'm going to show. We developed many rooms for the pavilion, for the Miss General Idea Pavilion, but I'm just going to show you one here which was never built. It's a maze, ziggurat maze from the 1984 Miss General Idea Pavilion. And it's made of plywood, and it's kind of based on the sort of maze that you would have found in the late 70s or early 80s in a gay steam bath with glory holes and so on and so forth. And we proposed it for an exhibition in '86 in Montreal, and it was an exhibition that was taking place in an abandoned mall right in the middle of Montreal. But they turned down the proposal on the basis that it was not wheelchair accessible. This is the armory from the Miss General Idea Pavilion. As we traveled around Europe, we realized that heraldry was really the original visual language of Western culture. And it's such an interesting and complex phenomenon. We started translating all of our own images into heraldic devices. So this is a group of 40 paintings, of which 10 are about 5 feet high, the big ones. Many of them with poodles, and they're all based on specific crests for specific cities or states or whatever in Europe, based on our travels as we went around. Because we had a big career of exhibiting in Europe in the late 70s and early 80s. We still hadn't shown in the US, but we showed all over Europe. This piece is called the Houndstooth Virus, and it's the first kind of hints of AIDS rearing its head. And this is called 9 Lives. And it's based on the crest for the city of Amsterdam, but again, there's this feeling of HIV and AIDS coming up in the background. And that's about the time we moved to New York and had our first show in the US. This is the AIDS logo. We made it originally for an exhibition in New York in '87, I think it was. We were invited to be in the first fundraising exhibition for the American Foundation for AIDS Research. And the idea was, I think there were about 20 or 25 galleries participated. Each gallery invited its gallery artist to either make a special piece or just donate a piece. And then the profits from selling those pieces were given to AMFAR. And we made this 6-foot square painting of this logo. And it's something we had been thinking about doing for about a year. And we would always think, oh my God, it's in such bad taste, we can't possibly do that. Which of course meant that we had to do it. And that image kind of took on a life of its own. We very quickly turned it into posters. We did poster campaigns on the streets in New York and San Francisco and Toronto and many other cities. And it was a time, you have to remember, when the word AIDS was not being spoken, most famously not being spoken by the President of the United States. So it was a kind of publicity campaign for a disease. It's also around then that we began to realize that the museum is really a part of popular culture. The museum, instead of being a kind of scholarly place where one can study and reflect on art, was being turned into a kind of turnstile situation in which maximum numbers of people had to be moved through a certain amount of space at the maximum speed. And so we began to use the museum as a part of the popular environment, the same as doing something on a bus or in a subway. You do something in a museum. So this is the Ades Wallpaper, which is actually up at the MCA right now, just opened last night on the 4th floor. We did an animation for the Spectacolor board in Times Square, now gone unfortunately. It was very primitive digital technology made of light bulbs, if you can believe it. And this was an animation in which the AIDS logos collided and turned into a love logo. We did an AIDS poster for the New York subway system. There were 4,500 posters in the New York subway system, which is one in every second car. Our idea was that the subway system was, in a way, like the bloodline of the city, and the subway penetrates every neighborhood, every economic group, every class. Over the course of our 25 years together, we produced over 300 multiples, and mostly low-cost multiples and editions. And this is a view of a traveling exhibition that went around showing, I guess a few years back now, showing all of those. And it's another view from the same exhibition here in, this is in the Kunsthalle in Zurich. In the, let's see, this would be the late 80s, a new self-portrait, night school. In retrospect, I realized it's shortly after we made this portrait that Jorge and Felix, well, actually Felix had already been diagnosed as HIV positive, but he hadn't told us. We were asked by Interview to make one of their artist calendars, and we made this, this is 91, we made this calendar of pills. Now, Felix claimed these were all the pills that he was in fact taking, but I know for sure that that's not true. He kind of bribed the pharmacist. He told him what it was for and bribed the local pharmacist to give him empty capsules. This piece is called 1 Day and 1 Year of AZT, 1 Day of AZT, 1 Year of AZT. Felix was taking 5 AZT pills a day at the time. I mean, our life was full of pills. Our apartment was full of pills, and this was, and so they became, in that very general idea way, they became part of our work. Felix was taking 5 a day, and you can see on the walls the groups of 5 with kind of calendar for his annual intake at the time. It was extremely toxic. And the 5 pills on the ground are a 1-day dosage. They're a little bit bigger than a human body. They're 7 feet long, so they have a kind of, they have a definite feeling that there's a body in them. Things started to get somehow lighter or airier. This is called Magic Bullet, 5,000 silver mylar balloons, the kind you might take to a hospital, but in the shape of the capsule pill, and printed with Magic Bullet and the general idea signature. And on the ground, a piece called Magic Carpet, made of, it's much bigger than it looks in this picture. It's 8 feet by 16 feet, and it's a bed of fluorescent bulbs was the only lighting for the piece. A similar piece, I think this was called Placebo Helium, in the city of Vienna. This is in the atrium to the main entrance to the subway system by the cathedral in the center of Vienna. Again, 5,000 pills. And the idea of these pieces is that as they deflate, which takes a few weeks, but as they deflate and come down, people can grab them and take them home. So the 5,000 pills gradually disappeared and ended up in the homes of people all over Vienna. And there, another self-portrait. This is from '83, I think. Self-portrait is 3 doctors listening to each other's hearts with the same red, green, and blue pills. Obviously, the colors are based on the Ades logo, and I haven't said it, but I'm sure you all know that the Ades logo is based on the Robert Indiana Love logo in the same colors. Those are the original colors to the first Love painting that he did. One of the things that interested us about the original Love painting was that Indiana lost copyright. At the time, to have copyright on it, you had to actually send in paperwork to the government, or you could put a copyright symbol with your signature on the painting, which he refused to do. And so he lost control over it, and consequently it became everything imaginable, you know, cocktail napkins, and the U.S. government printed a Love postage stamp, which they refused to give him any money for because he didn't own the copyright. One of the last projects we did, well, as Jorge and Felix got more and more sick, we eventually moved back to Toronto and rented a very big, fancy apartment that was big enough to hold wheelchairs and hospital beds and that kind of thing. And the Toronto medical system at that time, I don't know if it's still true, had this wonderful thing that if you had a terminal illness, which AIDS was at the time, and if you agreed that you wanted to die at home, then everything would get transferred into the home. You didn't go into the hospital anymore. The doctors came to your home, the nurses came to your home, and that's what we did. So we started to do much smaller works. These are obviously based on Mondrian paintings. We took illustrations from Mondrian paintings, blew them up onto gator board, and created these kind of infected reproductions of Mondrian's, because they're originally, of course, red, blue, and yellow. Green was Mondrian's most hated color. He famously painted the stem of a tulip white that he always kept on his work table. So these are infected Mondrians, and in the back you can see an infected Rietveld chair. The yellow is again being changed to green. It's Broadway Boogie Woogie on the back there. The very last piece we did together is this little book called Xxx Voto. It's based on a text by Yves Klein, and it's a text to Saint Rita, his patron saint, thanking him for his life. So we wrote our thank you to the spirit of Miss General Idea, and it's also a kind of thank you for the life we had together. So Jorge and Felix both died in '94, just a few months apart. And it took me many years to figure out how I could be an artist. I'd actually never been a solo artist. I'd spent my entire adult life working in collaboration. I didn't really know how to do anything else. And I guess also starting, first of all, in a commune before that, all my skills were based on consensus reaching and creating community, in a sense. This is the first work that I made after they died. It's 3 white Bertoia chairs with 3 standard cushions. The cushions happen to be available in this shape that's like a capsule pill in the red, green, and blue. And so I kind of consider this to be a general idea work, but it was made after they died, from '97, so 3 years after they died. And then still, I couldn't quite figure out, after they died, I stopped going to movies because Jorge had always read the movie reviews and always knew which were the good movies to go to, and I didn't know anymore. So it's kind of like that. I didn't know how to make art anymore. About 3 hours after Felix died, I took this photo. He received people like this in his bed for the last 3 weeks of his life. And it seemed he got more and more surrounded by color and pattern as he got closer to death. And eventually, he wasn't that sick. He just wasted away. He just lost so much weight that his body could not support life. And his eyes are open because there wasn't enough flesh left to close them. I should say, I was approached, I told the curator in Germany that I had this image and I wanted to do something with it, and I didn't quite have the courage to do anything with it, but I knew I wanted it to be big. I wanted it to be like a billboard. And she came to me finally with a project called Dream City, a show in Munich in 99. And so I made 6 prints for that show, 1 in the museum, and 5 we put out on billboards on the ring road, the inner ring road around Munich. And Munich is located very close to the part of Germany where a lot of the concentration camps were. And so there was immediately a kind of big dialogue about the relationship to Auschwitz and the other camps. I mean, Auschwitz isn't that close, but other camps were. And the similarity between the concentration camps and the situation with AIDS at the time was that a particular community, gay community in one case, the Jewish community in another, was having these kind of multiple traumas inflicted on them over a period of years, while the rest of the community around them was relatively unscathed. So, you would have memorials, deaths, infections, all these things happening in a kind of mixed up way and with never enough time to recover from one before the next arrived. These are photographs that I took of Jorge about a week before he died. He's blind here. And he asked me to take these photos because, in fact, his father had been a survivor from Auschwitz. And he thought that he looked as his father had looked when his father was released from Auschwitz, and he wanted me to document that fact. So these photos are about 6 feet high. There's a set in the collection of the Jewish Museum, although I'm not Jewish. I keep saying to them, why do you want to a work by a person who's not Jewish in the Jewish Museum, but it's up right now, actually, in New York. Oh, and this, some people will know, is in the Hide-Seek exhibition, which is currently at the Brooklyn Museum. And then to complete that set of death portraits, I made a portrait of the part of myself that died with them in this form of a kind of a sarcophagus. And there was a period, I'm going to forget the details, I think it's late 1600s in northern Germany, when a style developed for a sarcophagus for wealthy people that depicted them naked and rotting with worms coming out of their eye holes or whatever, instead of the usual finery that is depicted in most of them. Like, I think this second image over is probably taken from a cover of a sarcophagus, and that's more typical. I was at a point where I really didn't know what to do anymore, and I made this series of self-portraits. They're roughly life-size, based on the Hanged Man card from the tarot deck. And if you pull the Hanged Man, it indicates that something's cooking, there's lots going on, but there's nothing you can do to control it. You have to just wait and see what happens. Through all this period, I had been taking courses. Once I knew that Jorge and Felix were going to die, I had this idea that I wanted to be, how am I doing for time, by the way? I had this idea I wanted to be a midwife to the dying, and I began to take all kinds of sensible and crazy and sort of crazy courses, mostly in California. I had this idea I would work in a hospice after they died, but I was too burned out to do that. And then in around 99, 2000, I went back and took a refresher course and decided that I should become a professional healer. I went back to New York. I found friends of friends who were willing to come to me once a week for 6 months. And at the end of that 6 months, I let it be known that I was available for hire. And my career as a healer was kind of crazy. I was working 40 hours a week immediately, and I was exhausted. And I thought, if this identity, A.A. Bronson Healer, is so immediately successful, it was almost entirely people in the art world, then maybe I should make that my art identity, since I no longer have the identity of general idea. So this is from an exhibition at the power plant in Toronto. It's a billboard. I again returned to the kind of advertising media that general idea often used. So this was a kind of wall painting / billboard advertising my services. And this is at the John Connolly Gallery, 2004, I think, in New York. I set up a kind of spa. And the idea was that every morning before the gallery opened, I would do a massage session with someone, and every day after it closed, I would do another one, and some sort of energy would build up in the space. However, I threw my back out very dramatically before the opening, and consequently, there were no massages in the installation. But I was able to bring out my own massage oil and my own candles, because every healer should have their own line of products. And my own CD. Leap ahead a few years, 2008. Because I enjoyed my history of collaboration, I really came from a collaborative background, I began doing more and more collaborations again. This is a collaboration with Terence Coe. I don't remember the title, frankly. It has a very long and complicated title. And it's essentially 2 cubicles, as if they're for toilets, one entering from one side, one entering from the other. And in Terence's side, which is how we thought of it, is this collage of kind of goth punk gay boys. And then there's a glory hole through to the other side, which has a little book by me of found images from sex sites, amateur sex sites on the internet. So it doesn't seem to get used much, though. Oh, I throw this in as entertainment. You know, in 69, I wrote with a friend a book called Lena, the book on the far left. It was banned in Canada. Most of the copies were burned, so it's hard to find. And that publisher sold the rights to Grove Press, who brought out the book in the middle 1 year later, which also sold out pretty quickly and disappeared. And I've always wanted to do a new edition of that as a real artist book. So last year, I guess, I brought out the book on the right with the cover by Richard Prince, called Lana instead of Lena, because Lana backwards is anal. My co-writer had not agreed to it, and I had selfishly insisted on doing it anyway. So she took me to court. It was very complicated because we actually thought that Grove Press owned the copyright, and I contacted Grove Press, and they said no, because they had never renewed the copyright, so it was in the public realm. So I actually had the right to publish it, but my collaborator said she didn't care whether I had the right. She was going to take me to court anyway, because she has a very wealthy husband, and because she can make me go bankrupt. So I had to destroy them all. So here's my assistant, Gareth Long, tearing the covers off the books. And she insisted on receiving the covers. That to her was proof that we had destroyed the books. But of course, I kept all the actual books themselves. I still have them. And one day I'll do something with them. So self-portrait with books. I began to do a lot of kind of tabletop portraits. This is one I did for a magazine called Metropolis M from Amsterdam. I started doing a series of these images, and they'll make more sense to you. I mean, I was very interested in witchcraft and different kinds of threads of gay history. I was very interested in child abuse and concentration camps and all different forms of trauma, and also in the history of Tantra. So there's all these kind of sexual and trauma themes muddled together, which later became combined in this work, which is this is called Invocation of the Queer Spirits, and it's a series of performances I've been doing for the last few years. Each performance is a bit different and takes place in a different city. This is in Winnipeg. Their performances, it's a group of gay men. Their performances which are held in secret. There's no documentation. No one is invited except the participants. And in Winnipeg, we found this abandoned building, which I remembered from my school days there. And it was, in fact, going to be torn down the next day after the day we did this. And the new plug-in ICA in Winnipeg was built, in fact, on that site. So plug-in sponsored it, and we did, this was we just wrapped, we found a roll of nylon in the basement of this building, white nylon, and wrapped it around the columns. And it was the middle of winter, and inside, lit by candles, we did our performance for ourselves. Now, this is a picture of Governor's Island in New York. Governor's Island is off the south end of Manhattan, and it predates New York City. It was a military base. This was an officer's house. This is probably built in the 1800s, this particular house. It also had a prison, all-male prison. So for several centuries, it was an all-male community. It's also a kind of island of the dead. It was used as a place to put people to die who had yellow fever or things like that. So although the city is now making it into a public park, it's really a big cemetery. They don't tell you that. We were given, as part of a big project by Creative Time, I was given with my collaborator Peter Hobbs, we were given this house to do another Invocation of the Queer Spirits. And I don't know how, if I start talking about it in detail, I'll go on for too long, so I won't tell you too much. But the idea in this case was that you could see the remains from the performance from the following day onwards. This is in the foyer to the house. We blocked off the openings into the living room, the dining room, and the kitchen, and then we drilled these peepholes or glory holes through so that you could see what was going on the other side. And then here in the living room is the remains of the all-night invocation. It's like a mix between a seance, group therapy. I usually have a long list of things that it's based on, but for the moment they're escaping me. This is the image over the fireplace. It was forget his name now, it's the first governor who actually lived on Governor's Island, and he was a cross-dresser. He was married. He wore his wife's clothing to her funeral. Very eccentric guy. He built a huge pleasure garden on Governor's Island and was eventually fired as governor for his decadence. This is we did other performances in, Peter and I, in Banff, New Orleans, Fire Island, all places with significant stories of all-male populations, and also a lot of marginalized populations, all of which we designate as queer. What you see here is a series of prints, which is showing me in the costume that we wore for these events. We were all naked with a butt plug with rooster feathers tied to it, essentially. And so as you parade around, I mean, first of all, everybody looks so ridiculous that nobody can take themselves too seriously. That's always good for something like this. And then secondly, the butt plug sort of like locates you in your body. Like you cannot go into your head when you're wearing one of these things. You're really like fully in your body. And because we were invoking spirits, and I've had history with situations in which spirit possession took place, and I wanted to prevent that. The idea of the butt plug is that it locates you in your body and it prevents the spirit from entering, which so far seems to have happened quite nicely. And these prints, they're big silkscreen prints, about 6 feet high, and they're the surface is covered in baby diamonds. So this one is actually, the green one is, they're synthetic diamonds, which have a green cast to them. They're real, but they're synthetic. And then up here, the red one and the black one are black diamonds. They're titanium-coated diamonds. And then the remaining one is copper-coated diamonds. And I'm carrying a sheaf of sweetgrass. This is an installation photo from the Esther Schipper Gallery in Berlin, where I had a show last October. And I show this primarily, I wouldn't normally show this image, except I don't have any proper photos of the painting on the ground, which is a collaboration with Elijah Berger. And this is as it looked. This is as it looked when we finished painting it, and also when we started installing it. This is what it looked like after another invocation of the queer spirits had taken place, using that painting as the kind of drop cloth, as the base for the performance. And this is Elijah with the painting just as we finished it. And this, again, is the same part of the painting after or during the performance. After, I think. This is before. Now, I never document these performances, but I actually realized at some point that I had my camera in there with me, so I actually did take 2 photos of this particular one. This is Vincent Simon from Paris, and this is Dino from Istanbul, who seems to have passed out. But this is a piece, well, I show this just to show the scale, but then this is a better reproduction of it. It's called Black, Red, Gold, and it's a collaboration with Ryan Brewer from New York. And it's a series of rituals that we did in the woods in Fire Island Pines. And that's a woods which is famous for having all these little sex paths through it. And it's a gay cruising site for many decades. And so we produced these portraits out of it. It was great being painted red and naked because you really could walk around and not feel naked. It was weird. It was very weird. I felt very bold. Again, at the Esther Schiffer Gallery, in the back, in the garden behind, I did another performance, which was a kind of public blessing of this sculpture. The sculpture is called Kanchipuram. It's made of black basalt. It's based on the traditional lingams from the Shiva temples in India. And I'm pouring milk, honey, yogurt, warm water, sugar water, and one other thing that I'm not remembering at the moment. Oh, a ghee, butter, clarified butter, in sequence over the top as a kind of blessing. And talking about what I'm doing at the same time. You can see the little copper, all the little copper pots on the little table. Those are the implements that are traditionally used for that purpose. And this is the following day. It gives you a little bit of a better idea about the sculpture itself. And I'm working now on a whole series of these. This is a kind of prototype. It's probably the most traditional artwork I've ever made. Now, I do have pictures about printed matter and the New York Art Book Fair, but I suspect I've used up all my time. Hmm? Should I go through them very quickly? So that's Printed Matter's storefront in New York, and Printed Matter's been around, some of you may know, for 35 years, usually in storefronts. This is on 10th Avenue between 21st and 22nd. This is when we first opened that space. I took over in 2004. It was dying at that point. It owed a lot of money to artists. And I was on the board, and the board asked me if I would become the director for 6 months to check out if it could be saved or whether it should be closed. And 6 years later, I was still there. We built this interior, designed by my partner, Mark Krajinhoff. And here's a couple of photos of the interior. It's a very hyperactive space. And there are artist books by about 5,000 artists in there. There's over 15,000 titles. It's an amazing resource. This is a view of a Jenny Holzer window in the Lispenard Street, I think it's the Lispenard Street site, when they first opened in Tribeca. And I believe it was Jenny's first show, in fact. And this, that's a Richard Prince, and it's either his first or second. I think it's also his first show was in the Printed Matter windows. This is by, this is all the pocket romance books set on end, so the kind that had, from the 50s, that had the color edges. And is it Rob Lowe? I always get Rob Lowe and his brother mixed up. Somebody Lowe. So it forms a kind of carpet because it kind of gives under your feet. So it made a kind of reading room at the back of Printed Matter. This is the New York Art Book Fair, which we first put on at the old DIA site 6 years ago. You know, at a certain point, we were thinking about the fact that New York used to be such a center for books and for art books especially, and all the great art bookstores have closed. And we thought it would be nice to think of some way to bring that feeling of New York as an art book center back again. So we hired somebody for 1 month to see if they could figure out, you know, is it worth doing a book fair? And we were aiming to have 35 exhibitors. And by the end of the month, we had 70. So we went ahead and did our her first book fair. Now we typically have like 260, 280 exhibitors from 24 countries. Most of the people who come are on the young side, and it's incredibly hyper busy place. We had 16,000 visitors at last year. We do it now in PS1. It'll be at the end of September this year. 16,000 people in 3 days, and that's 20% of their annual attendance. This is a room put together by Werkplatz Typography, which is the a really amazing graphic design school in Holland. They bring their entire student body, which is only 17 people, but still. They bring their entire student body with them and do a project every year. And this is Josh Smith with his artist book stand, all his posters. This is an exhibition called Learn to Read Art. It's a history of printed matter that we put together for an exhibition in the south of Germany. And it includes, as it turns out, 300 books, editions, bits of ephemera and so on, but are designed by artists that have been produced in the 35 years of printed matter. And so this exhibition kind of documented that. This is the Ades room. And you can see the Jenny Holzer, the Baldassari on the right, and many other things in there. This is a piece by Josh Smith. He produced a book. He did a poster for the New York Art Book Fair, numbered all the posters, took the table that he'd used to put the silkscreen on and cut it up and made it into book covers, like this, and declared that he'd made actually a 2-volume book in the form of all these numbered posters. So that's what these are the pages of the book on display. And Gareth Long made these sort of book-like shapes on the floor which allowed people to lounge around and read the books and look at them at their leisure and so on. There's also skateboards on the wall by artists that we've published. Oh, and I want to show you this. This is a book that actually has come out now. These were the mock-ups. It's a book of pop-ups by Taube Auerbach. This one was dedicated to General Idea. And that's where I'm going to stop. Do we have time for questions?
Yes. A lot of your later work seems to have a somewhat vague, mystic quality to it, and I wondered if you could speak a little bit more, because I'm sure it's specific to you, and I would wonder if you could speak a little bit more about specifically where you draw your different lines from, I guess, or where you what sources you glean from.
It's a 65-year story, I'm afraid, but don't know quite where to begin. I mean, maybe it's best to work in the present. I'm currently studying at Union Theological Seminary, not because I intend to be a priest, but because Christianity is the one religion that I've ignored in my life, and I thought I should maybe just catch up a bit. And I've started the Institute for Art, Religion, and Social Justice while I've been there. I was involved with Tibetan Buddhism for 14 years, starting in '83, when, by a very strange set of coincidences, I ended up in Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama's court is, with a private audience photographing the Dalai Lama for the cover of a book. He was 10 days late for that appointment. And so for 10 days, actually the sister of the Dalai Lama had me and my partner Jorge in a kind of immersion course on Tibetan Buddhism, which also involves some kind of it's an amazing and kind of long story, so I won't tell it all now, but that probably is a big piece of that story. In the early 70s, I was in Venezuela and had a kind of run-in with a white witch, which I realized in retrospect was either voodoo or Santeria, one of those Afro-Christian religions, and that also was just a really phenomenal experience that lasted about 8 or 9 days. So that also had a big effect on my life. I think one of the biggest things was that when I was 7, at the age of 7, I had a 1-year perfect attendance for going to Sunday school, and I loved Sunday school. And I had a great Sunday school teacher who was very much about religious education. And then a new Sunday school teacher came in, which was a couple who had been missionaries in Africa. And they started really just showing us slides of children in Africa every week and basically babysitting us. And I got so pissed off at them that they were not teaching us anything that I told my parents I wasn't going to go to church anymore. So that's how I left the Christian church. But there's been other things along the way. I've made reference to experiences with spirit possessions and things like that. I seem to have trod a complicated path that's taken me, I've intersected with many oddball experiences along the way that have taken me on that particular route, I guess. I don't know. It's not something I can answer in a few sentences, but.
Sort of in line with that, I was curious about, like, at the beginning of talking about the rituals, you brought up feeling ridiculous in front of each other because of bugs, and I was interested in this, like, the quality of humor and ridiculousness as well, also being sincere within that kind of mystical construct.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak about maybe there's specific influences or thoughts in that space? And I guess I'm curious if it intersects with radical theory.
Not specifically. Although it's kind of something similar at work there. My immediate thought is back to the Tibetans again, because in that first meeting with the Tibetans, the High Lamas, like, they were all in their 80s at that point, and they had escaped Tibet with the Dalai Lama, and they didn't live much longer. They were all like 85, 86. They were all so mischievous. It was like unbelievable. The Dalai Lama would be trying to give some sort of teaching, and there was this big fat monk, Lama Yeshe, and he'd bought this little disposable camera, like a little bright plastic, and he would leap around in front of the Dalai Lama, taking his picture sort of during the teaching. It was so revealing in a way, like it was interesting that in this religion, there was a place for humor. In a way, nothing was sacred, or maybe humor was sacred. That somehow these things were intertwined. That humor was not out of place, and it kept everybody's feet on the ground and kept them real. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask about your collaborations with younger artists,
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, I've been curious about how so much of the work you did with General Idea had to do with HIV/AIDS and death, and I'm wondering how these later works, like the Invocation, relate to that earlier work, because you didn't speak like explicitly to disease or illness or death about those works.
Well, yeah, maybe I should have said more about that. I mean, we're invoking the spirits of the dead, so there's death implicit there. But I guess the main idea behind those pieces is that we are a community of the living and the dead. And we tend to forget about the dead once they're gone and only think about the living. But the dead are still very much an influence and a presence in our lives. So I think that's the primary thing about those pieces.
And what about like the intergenerational? Because I find it interesting that that's a sort of generational contact that's happening
Mm-hmm.
between, younger artists that maybe were born in the 70s or 80s or that kind of thing, and then a sort of contact that's happening, in those particular spaces.
Well, I find that for a lot of younger queer artists, there's this feeling that I wouldn't call it jealousy exactly, but it's like this feeling that they haven't experienced the same range of things that the people, a generation or two older have experienced. And there's a kind of sadness almost about not having been part of that in some weird way, So that's part of it. But also, well, I find in the just to think about the educational system for a moment, let's think about art schools, that there's so much, in general, there's so much emphasis in the marketplace in terms like career development and things like that. And, art, I always think of art as a vocation. Art chooses you, you don't choose it. And it's being taught in a very different way right now. So I find a lot of the young people, younger artists tend to find me, and they're usually very often people who are, quite a lot of them are still in school. And it's often this dissatisfaction with the current situation, that it doesn't feed their particular hunger to be artists. So I think that plays into it as well. And then I think because queer people don't have the natural, the same form of mentoring, that you have to kind of find your mentor. I never had a mentor, really. You have to kind of find your mentors in life, and so I'm always conscious of, as an older queer person, that's something I should be doing, is to be a kind of mentor to those who are younger. I think it's something we need more of.
Time for one more question. I didn't hear you mention the term social practice at all during your talk, and I'm just curious about, I feel like it's something that is like a very popular term at the moment, and it's kind of interesting to even use that, and also the earlier parts of your career seem to be so much more easily labeled as something like that, but your later work seems to actually be more object-based during a time when it seems like social practice is so acceptable. So I'm just curious about that.
Well, we did so many of those things before those names existed, so I tend to not bother with all that language. And I like to give these lectures so that somebody doesn't have to have an art background to understand them. So I try to use as plain a language as possible. So I kind of ignore all of that.
What about
what about the objects?
Or does it I guess I'm just curious also about how that term has become so popular and how it's. I'm
No,
curious as to what your thoughts are on.
No, in a way, no, I love the fact that has become an accepted way to work now. And I think, I was saying to Zach earlier, I think the reason I got the Chevalier, the knighthood in France, is because of the influence we had on French artists like Pierre Huyghe or Dominique Gonzalez-Torres or some of the other people, some of whom do a kind of social practice. So I kind of feel like I own social practice, that I don't have to talk about it, though I can keep it to myself. Thank you.